November 22nd, 1944. A wooded hillside 800 yards from Lohn, Germany. Hauptmann Friedrich Kellner crouched behind his Panzer-Proof 88mm anti-tank gun, watching an American column advance through his gunsight. At the column's head moved a Sherman tank, but something about its silhouette looked wrong. The hull sat too high. The turret looked too thick. The glacis plate caught the pale autumn light at an angle he'd never seen before.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special.
His loader, Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, whispered the obvious question. That's a Sherman, isn't it? Kellner had killed 17 Allied tanks since Normandy. He knew every variant of the M4. The standard Sherman's frontal armour measured 51mm, angled at 56 degrees. His Pak-43 could penetrate 90mm of armour at 1,000 metres. At 800 yards, killing a Sherman required only competent aim and patience. He'd been doing it since July, but this tank approaching through the German wood line appeared different, heavier, more deliberate in its movements. The mathematics of tank warfare in late 1944 followed brutal simplicity. German anti-tank guns outmatched American armour by design. The Sherman's reputation as a death trap had been earned through thousands of burning hulks scattered across France and Belgium. American tankers called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter advertisement that boasted they lit the first time, every time. Kellner had witnessed that terrible truth firsthand. A single, well-placed 88mm round through a Sherman's front plate would detonate ammunition, ignite fuel, and transform 5 men into casualties within seconds. This mathematical certainty had governed tank combat since Normandy, and Kellner trusted it completely. He ordered Schmidt to load armour-piercing. The gun's breech closed with its familiar metallic snap. Through his sight, Kellner tracked the strange Sherman as it crested a small rise, exposing its full frontal aspect. He centered his crosshairs on the glacis plate, exhaled slowly, and fired. The gun recoiled. Schmidt chambered another round while Kellner watched for the penetration, the catastrophic secondary explosion, the hatches flying open, the smoke. None came. The round had struck the glacis dead center at optimal penetration angle. The tank kept moving. Kellner saw the impact mark, a bright scar on dark metal where his 88mm tungsten cord projectile had met American steel and lost. He fired again. The second round hit higher, near where the glacis met the hull. Again, no penetration. The Sherman's turret traversed toward his position with mechanical precision. Kellner fired a third time, aiming for the gun mantlet. The massive circular shield absorbed the impact without visible effect. His fourth round struck the telescope aperture, the gun sight opening that represented the weakest point in any tank's armour. This round penetrated, but not into the crew compartment. It entered the gun mantlet assembly itself, jamming the turret traverse mechanism. The Sherman halted, immobilized but not destroyed. Through his sight, Kellner could see the crew evacuating through the turret hatches. All 5 men escaped. He'd fired 4 rounds at optimal range against an American medium tank and failed to achieve a single crew casualty. 300 meters to Kellner's left, another Pak-43 engaged a second American tank of identical design. That crew fired 8 rounds. 1 penetrated the right sponson after the tank had struck a mine and become immobilized. 7 rounds failed to penetrate at all. The target burned, not from the anti-tank gun's killing power, but because the mine had ruptured fuel lines and the single penetrating round had ignited gasoline already pooling beneath the hull. What Kellner could not know, crouched in his gun position while American artillery began ranging his battery, was that he'd just encountered serial number 50473, registration number 3083070, one of exactly 254 examples of the assault tank M4A3E2. The nickname Jumbo wouldn't appear in official documents until years after the war. American tankers in November 1944 simply called them the thick ones. German gunners had no name for them at all. They simply knew, with sudden and disorienting certainty, that the fundamental equation of tank combat had changed. The story of how that equation changed begins not in November 1944, but in February of that year, when American planners confronted an uncomfortable truth about Operation Overlord. The Sherman tank, despite its reliability and mechanical excellence, would be obsolete by the time it reached Normandy's hedgerows. German armour had evolved beyond the M4's capacity to engage effectively. The Tiger's frontal armour measured 100 millimeters. The Panther's sloped glacis offered equivalent protection to 140 millimeters of vertical plate. Meanwhile, the standard Sherman's 51 millimeter frontal armour could be penetrated by virtually every German anti-tank weapon in service. The Army ground forces understood this disparity. They'd requested development of heavy tanks since 1942. The T-14 assault tank had proven too slow and too complex for mass production. The T-26E1, which would eventually become the M26 Pershing, remained months away from combat readiness. The invasion of France could not wait for ideal solutions. It required adequate solutions manufactured quickly using existing industrial capacity. In February 1944, the ground forces submitted a request: convert the current M4A3 Sherman into an assault tank using only existing components and manufacturing facilities already producing Shermans. The timeline permitted no experimentation, no prototyping, no developmental delays. Production had to begin immediately. The Fisher body tank plant in Grand Blanc, Michigan received the contract in March 1944. Fisher specialized in automotive body fabrication, a civilian skill that translated imperfectly to armor plate welding. The plant had been producing standard Shermans since April 1942. Its workers understood hull assembly, turret mounting, and final drive installation. The M4A3E2 conversion would test whether they could engineer solutions under wartime pressure without formal military specifications. The engineering challenge appeared straightforward: increase frontal armor thickness to withstand German 88mm fire at typical combat ranges. Do so without redesigning the suspension, transmission, or powertrain. Use only armor plate and components already in production. Deliver 250 units by June 1944. The apparent simplicity concealed profound technical problems. Every pound of additional armor increased ground pressure, stressed suspension components, and reduced maximum speed. The M4A3's Ford GAAV-8 engine produced 500 horsepower, adequate for a 30-ton tank but marginal for anything heavier. The vertical volute spring suspension system had been designed around the M4's original weight distribution. Additional armor would overload the front bogies, accelerate spring failure, and potentially crack the hull. Fisher's engineers approached the problem through systematic addition rather than fundamental redesign. They welded 38.1mm rolled armor plates directly onto the M4A3's existing hull structure. The glacis plate received additional armor, increasing total thickness from 51mm to 101.6mm. The hull sides received similar treatment, growing from 38mm to 76.2mm. The differential cover and final drives, particularly vulnerable to German anti-tank guns, gained armor until they measured 139.7mm thick. The tank's weight increased by exactly 4,989.6 kilograms, more than 11,000 pounds of armor plate welded onto structure never intended to bear it. The turret presented different challenges. Rather than modify the standard Sherman turret, Fisher adapted the T-23 medium tank's turret design. The T-23 program had been cancelled, but its turret incorporated features the M4A3E2 required. The T-23 turret offered 152.4mm of armor all around, reduced only at the rear to 63.5mm below the radio bustle. This turret, mounted on a Sherman hull, created unprecedented protection for an American medium tank. The gun mantlet received special attention. Fisher welded additional armor plate to the standard M62 mantlet, creating a total thickness of 177.8mm. This massive shield protected the gun mount but created a problem. Its weight prevented the driver's and assistant driver's hull hatches from opening fully.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Fisher's solution involved cutting away the mantlet's lower corners, creating the M4A3E2's distinctive notched appearance. The additional armor created a tank weighing 42.6 metric tons, 12.6 tons heavier than a standard Sherman. Ground pressure would have increased catastrophically, immobilizing the vehicle in soft terrain. Fisher addressed this through track modification rather than suspension redesign. They fitted extended end connectors, called duckbills by crews, to the outside edge of each track shoe. These extensions increased track width from 16.5 inches to 20.1 inches, distributing weight across a larger footprint. The resulting ground pressure measured 14.2 pounds per square inch, actually slightly lower than the standard M4A3's 14.3 pounds per square inch. This simple solution demonstrated engineering practicality under wartime constraints. Rather than redesign the suspension to handle additional weight, Fisher simply made the tank's footprint larger. The powertrain modifications reflected similar pragmatism. The Ford GAA engine remained unchanged, but Fisher increased the final drive ratio to reduce maximum speed. Where a standard Sherman could reach 26 miles per hour on roads, the M4A3E2 managed 22 miles per hour at maximum throttle. This reduction in speed extended engine life and reduced transmission strain, critical considerations for a tank that would spend its operational life leading assaults rather than pursuing breakthroughs. The Americans understood that assault tanks needed protection, not velocity. Armament selection revealed American doctrine regarding the M4A3E2's intended role. The tank mounted the 75mm M3 gun rather than the newer 76mm M1. This choice confused post-war analysts who assumed anti-tank capability mattered most. It didn't. The M4A3E2 was designed for infantry support, not tank versus tank combat. The 75mm gun's high-explosive shell contained 0.66 kilograms of explosives, compared to the 76mm's 0.39 kilograms. Against fortifications, against infantry positions, against the tactical targets an assault tank would encounter, the shorter 75mm gun proved more effective. The turret's design, based on the T-23's large turret ring, permitted easy conversion to the 76mm gun if tactical requirements changed. In February 1945, approximately 100 M4A3E2s received 76mm guns in field modifications that required 75 man-hours per tank. Production began in May 1944. Fisher Body completed 40 tanks that month, serial numbers 50326 through 50365, registration numbers 3082923 through 3082962. June saw 110 units, serial numbers 50366 through 50475. July produced 104 additional tanks, serial numbers 50476 through 50579. Total production reached 254 units, one more than the original contract specified. The entire program, from initial request to final delivery, consumed just 4 months. No other combatant nation in World War II could have executed such rapid development and production. Serial number 50326 went immediately to the Chrysler Tank Arsenal Proving Ground for endurance testing. The tests revealed problems Fisher's engineers had anticipated. The vertical volute spring suspension, particularly the front bogies, experienced premature failure under the M4A3E2's weight. Springs cracked, bogie assemblies worked loose. The problem persisted throughout the tank's service life. Crews learned to expect suspension maintenance at intervals shorter than standard Shermans required. This represented acceptable compromise. The tanks could complete their missions before suspension failed, and field maintenance could address failures as they occurred. Serial number 50360, nicknamed Tom, arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground for ballistic testing in June 1944. The tests, classified as information only, would determine what the M4A3E2's armour could withstand. Aberdeen's engineers mounted weights to simulate a combat-loaded tank and began firing captured German weapons at various ranges and angles. The results exceeded specifications. At 800 metres, the German Park 43 88mm anti-tank gun, the most powerful towed anti-tank weapon in Wehrmacht inventory, could not reliably penetrate the M4A3E2's glacis plate. At 600 metres, penetration remained uncertain, dependent on impact angle and ammunition quality. Only at ranges below 400 metres did the 88mm achieve consistent penetration. The mathematics that governed this resistance involved more than simple armour thickness. The M4A3E2's glacis plate sat at 47 degrees from vertical. This angle transformed the plate's physical thickness into effective thickness against projectiles striking at perpendicular angles. The relative armour thickness, calculated by dividing actual thickness by the sign of impact angle, reached 148.84 mm for shots striking the glacis perpendicularly. Most combat engagements occurred at angles less than perpendicular, further increasing effective protection. The Germans' most common anti-tank gun, the PaK 40-75mm, proved incapable of penetrating the M4A3E2's frontal armour at any practical combat range. Aberdeen tested Tom to destruction, firing progressively more powerful weapons until the armour failed. The final report, declassified decades after the war, concluded that the M4A3E2 provided frontal protection equivalent to German heavy tanks, while retaining the Sherman's mechanical reliability and operational simplicity. This represented precisely what the Army ground forces had requested, an assault tank capable of leading infantry attacks against fortified positions without requiring the logistical support structure a true heavy tank demanded. By August 29, 1944, the U.S. 12th Army Group received notification that 250 M4A3E2 tanks awaited shipment. The tanks began arriving at the New York port of embarkation in mid-August. By September 8, 208 had sailed for Europe. The crossing took roughly 2 weeks. Initial shipments reached Cherbourg around September 22, 6 months after the invasion planners had first requested an assault tank, 4 months after production began. This timeline represented wartime industrial capacity, operating at maximum efficiency. The tanks required processing before reaching combat units. Ordnance crews at Cherbourg removed shipping brackets, installed external equipment packed in crates during transport, performed final mechanical checks, and prepared each tank for forward movement. This processing consumed additional time. The logistical situation in the European theatre complicated matters further. Allied forces had advanced faster than supply lines could extend. Priority shipping went to ammunition and fuel rather than new vehicle types. The M4A3E2s, despite their high priority status, waited at depot facilities while more urgent cargo moved forward. On October 14, 1944, First Army received the initial 36 M4A3E2 tanks. They were distributed to 3 separate tank battalions. The 743rd Tank Battalion received 15. The 745th Tank Battalion received 15. The 746th Tank Battalion received 6, with 9 additional units arriving by November 9th. These independent tank battalions supported infantry divisions, rather than operating as part of armoured divisions. The assignment reflected American tactical doctrine. Assault tanks would lead infantry attacks against fortified positions, absorbing defensive fire that would destroy standard Shermans. The crews who received these tanks understood immediately that something fundamental had changed. Sergeant James Morrison of the 743rd Tank Battalion later wrote that his crew examined their assigned M4A3E2 with mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief because the additional armour might let them survive combat encounters that killed standard Sherman crews routinely. Apprehension because the tank's weight and reduced speed made it less manoeuvrable in situations requiring quick repositioning. The M4A3E2 demanded different tactical thinking. It couldn't outrun German tanks. It couldn't hide easily. It could only advance, absorb punishment, and keep fighting. The first combat engagements occurred near Aachen in October 1944. The 745th Tank Battalion supported the 1st Infantry Division's assault on Germany's ancient imperial city. The M4A3E2 led the attack columns, their thick armour providing the assault element First Army's planners had envisioned. German defenders engaged them with 88mm anti-tank guns, positioned in prepared positions. The guns that had destroyed thousands of Shermans across France and Belgium now fired at targets engineered specifically to resist them. The results confused German gunners accustomed to reliable kill ratios. At Aachen, Panzer-Proof reported multiple hits without penetration. Tank commanders reported ammunition expenditure far exceeding normal requirements for Sherman kills. Intelligence officers struggled to explain why American tanks suddenly demonstrated survivability characteristics inconsistent with known M4 variants. Some reports suggested the Americans had received British Churchill tanks, which possessed similar armour thickness. Others speculated about completely new American heavy tanks entering service. The truth, that the Americans had simply added armour to existing Shermans, seemed simultaneously too simple and too effective to accept easily. The German military intelligence assessment of Allied armour, dated October 1944 and captured after the war, reveals this confusion. The document acknowledges reports of heavily armoured American tanks, but dismisses them as modifications rather than new designs. The assessment concludes that such vehicles, if they existed in significant numbers, would prove mechanically unreliable due to automotive component strain. This conclusion reflected reasonable engineering analysis. The Germans had experienced similar problems when up-armouring their own tanks. The Panther's final drive failures stemmed partly from weight increases during development. The Tiger's transmission required frequent maintenance under combat conditions. The assumption that American tanks would suffer similar problems seemed logical. But the M4A3E2 didn't fail mechanically as German analysis predicted. The Ford GAA engine, designed with considerable power reserve, handled the additional weight adequately. The transmission, already robust in standard Shermans, required no modification. The duckbill track extensions distributed weight effectively enough to prevent the catastrophic suspension failures German engineers expected. The Americans had solved the up-armouring problem not through sophisticated engineering, but through pragmatic application of excess industrial capacity. They'd simply added more armour until the tank could survive, then adjusted tracks and gear ratios until it could still move. The result lacked elegance but achieved effectiveness. By late November 1944, 45 M4A3E2s served with 1st Army units. 3rd Army received its allocation of 90 tanks starting in late October. 9th Army acquired 60 tanks by mid-November. The distribution pattern placed these assault tanks with independent tank battalions attached to infantry divisions conducting offensive operations in fortified areas. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive barrier, represented exactly the tactical situation the M4A3E2 had been designed to address. Concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, prepared defensive positions, all protected by anti-tank guns positioned for optimal fields of fire. The 743rd Tank Battalion, operating near Frunhoven, northeast of Aachen, encountered the tactical reality of assault tank combat in late November. 2 M4A3E2s engaged German defensive positions at ranges between 600 and 800 meters. One tank struck a mine, immobilizing it. German anti-tank guns, likely PaK-43 88mm weapons based on shell caliber found at the scene, engaged both tanks. The immobilized tank received 8 hits. 1 round penetrated the right sponson, igniting fuel and destroying the tank. 7 rounds failed to penetrate despite striking frontal armor at optimal angles. The second tank received 4 hits before the 4th round entered through the gun telescope aperture, the weakest point in the mantlet design. 3 rounds had struck and failed to penetrate before that 4th shot found the vulnerable opening. These engagement reports reached higher commands with implications that extended beyond simple tactical assessment. American armor, previously vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons at all practical combat ranges, had achieved protection levels that forced German crews to expend multiple rounds and seek specific weak points. The psychological impact on both sides proved as significant as the tactical results. American crews gained confidence that their tanks could survive hits that would have killed them in standard Shermans. German crews lost confidence that their anti-tank guns could achieve reliable kills against American armor. The mathematical transformation this represented can be quantified. Against standard M4 Shermans, German Panzer-Proof crews in late 1944 averaged 1.3 rounds per kill at ranges between 500 and 1,000 meters. Against M4A3E2s, that average increased to between 4 and 8 rounds per kill, and only when crews could achieve hits on specific vulnerable points. The telescope aperture, the turret ring, the rear hull, the lower side plates behind the tracks, the frontal armor that had defined Sherman vulnerability throughout the war had become, if not invulnerable, at least resistant enough to change tactical calculations. The German response to the M4A3E2 emerged not through official doctrine revision, but through tactical adaptation at the company and battery level. Anti-tank gun crews who encountered these heavy Shermans learned through costly experience that standard engagement procedures no longer guaranteed kills. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Becker, serving with a PaK 43 battery near Düren in December 1944, later described the frustration of watching armor-piercing rounds strike American tanks without penetrating. His battery commander ordered crews to cease fire after the first non-penetrating hit and relocate immediately. The Americans had learned to identify gun positions through muzzle flash and would direct artillery fire within minutes of the first shot. Wasting ammunition on targets that wouldn't die merely revealed your position to American counter-battery radar. This tactical adjustment represented a complete reversal of German anti-tank doctrine developed since 1939. For 5 years, German gunners had enjoyed consistent kill ratios against Allied armor. French tanks in 1940 possessed thick armor but poor mechanical reliability and inadequate tactical employment. Soviet tanks in 1941 and 1942 combined excellent armor with terrible crew training and coordination. British tanks throughout North Africa demonstrated vulnerability to German 88mm guns at ranges where British 2-pounders and 6-pounders couldn't effectively respond. American Shermans, arriving in Tunisia in late 1942, continued this pattern. Thick enough armor to resist small anti-tank guns, but vulnerable to the Wehrmacht's standard 75mm and 88mm weapons at all combat ranges. The M4A3E2 broke this pattern completely. German armor troops encountered the same problem from different perspectives. Lieutenant Karl Heinz, commanding a Panther tank in the 116th Panzer Division during December 1944, engaged American armor near Hotten, Belgium. His after-action report, captured by American forces and translated in 1945, describes firing 3 75mm rounds at what he initially identified as a standard Sherman. All 3 rounds struck the target's frontal armor. None penetrated. The American tank returned fire with a 75mm gun that couldn't penetrate his Panther's frontal armor at that range. Both tanks withdrew after exhausting their engagement without achieving penetration. Heinz noted in his report that the American tank demonstrated armor protection comparable to a Tiger, but retained the Sherman's characteristic profile and smaller size. This encounter reveals the fundamental dilemma the M4A3E2 created for German armor doctrine. The Panther had been designed specifically to outmatch the Sherman. Its 75mm K-42 gun could penetrate standard Sherman armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters. Its sloped frontal armor, 100mm thick at 55 degrees, provided protection against the Sherman's 75mm gun at all but point-blank ranges. The Panther had been engineered to achieve technical superiority over Allied medium tanks through superior armor and armament. The M4A3E2's armor negated the Panther's primary advantage. German medium tanks could no longer reliably kill American medium tanks at standard combat ranges. The Tiger faced similar problems, despite its 88mm gun's superior penetration. Hauptmann Ernst Bachmann, a Tiger ace with the 2nd SS Panzer Division, engaged M4A3E2 during the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. His combat report describes achieving frontal hits at 700 meters without penetrating. He withdrew rather than risk closer engagement, where American tanks could target his Tiger's side armor. This represented unprecedented caution from German heavy tank commanders, who had operated throughout the war with confidence that their armor and armament provided decisive advantages. The appearance of American tanks that couldn't be easily destroyed from the front forced German armor to reconsider engagement tactics developed through years of successful combat. The Battle of the Bulge, beginning December 16, 1944, tested the M4A3E2 under the worst possible tactical circumstances. German forces achieved tactical surprise, surrounded American units, and fought under weather conditions that grounded Allied air support. The offensive's initial success created exactly the scenario German planners had envisioned: close-range combat in restricted terrain, where German armor's technical advantages could overcome Allied numerical superiority. Within this chaos, the M4A3E2 performed their designed role, leading American counterattacks and providing mobile firepower that could survive German anti-tank fire. The 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division received 15 M4A3E2 in late October 1944. One of these tanks, registration number 3083084, was assigned to Company C as the company commander's tank. The crew named it Cobra King. By late November, Cobra King had participated in the advance through France and Luxembourg, engaging German defensive positions and providing infantry support. On November 7th, near Fontenoy, Cobra King took a shell hit to the final drive assembly that disabled the tank temporarily. Field maintenance crews repaired the damage, but the battle scar remained visible, a permanent reminder of the tank's combat history. When German forces launched their Ardennes offensive on December 16th, the 4th Armored Division was positioned south of the breakthrough area. As German penetration expanded, American command recognized that the critical crossroads town of Bastogne required immediate relief. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and under siege, could not hold indefinitely without resupply and reinforcement. Patton's Third Army received orders to pivot north and break through German lines to reach Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division would spearhead this relief effort. The 37th Tank Battalion would lead the spearhead. Cobra King would lead the battalion. The tactical situation around Bastogne by December 26th combined all the elements that made World War II combat unpredictable. German forces had established defensive positions along all approaches to the town. American intelligence remained uncertain about German unit locations and strength. Weather conditions kept visibility poor and roads icy. The relief column would advance through terrain where German anti-tank guns and armor could engage from prepared positions. Standard military doctrine suggested such an attack would fail, that attacking through prepared defenses without air support and adequate reconnaissance risked destruction of the entire relief force. Captain William Dwight, temporarily commanding the 37th Tank Battalion's lead element, made tactical decisions that prioritized speed over security. The column would advance at maximum velocity along a secondary road from Cloquimont through Assenois to Bastogne. They would fire continuously in all directions and would not stop for any reason. German forces wouldn't expect an attack along that particular route, and surprise might compensate for the column's vulnerability. Cobra King would lead because its armor provided the best chance of surviving whatever defensive fire the Germans directed at the first vehicle to appear. The advance began in late afternoon on December 26th. Cobra King's commander, First Lieutenant Charles Boggess, kept the tank moving at maximum speed for the M4A3E2's weight and road conditions. Behind him followed 7 additional Shermans, half-tracks carrying infantry, and support vehicles. The column moved with deliberate disregard for tactical caution, gambling that velocity and firepower would overcome defensive preparation. As they cleared Cloquimont, Dwight called for artillery support on Assenois ahead. 4 artillery battalions responded, dropping high explosive shells on the town while the column advanced directly into their impact zone. This required precise timing. The artillery had to suppress German defenders without hitting the advancing American vehicles. The column had to maintain speed despite reduced visibility and uncertain road conditions. They entered Assenois while American artillery was still falling. German defensive fire erupted from buildings and prepared positions. The column's tanks fired their main guns and machine guns continuously, engaging targets as they appeared. They didn't stop to assess damage or confirm kills. Infantry in the half-tracks fired from their positions, adding rifle and automatic weapons fire to the sustained barrage. The column directed at anything that might contain German troops. The tactic, described by survivors as controlled chaos, violated standard doctrine but achieved its objective. German defenders, expecting a deliberate attack with infantry clearing each position, instead faced a mechanized column that shot at everything while refusing to slow down. Cobra King destroyed a pillbox beyond Assenois with a direct hit from its 75mm gun. German fire knocked out 4 Shermans in the column behind it, but the remaining vehicles kept moving. As Cobra King cleared the woods beyond Assenois, Bogues saw an open field marked with colored parachute canopies from previous supply drops. American lines lay ahead. He slowed the tank, cautious now that friendly troops might be nearby. Figures in foxholes appeared. Bogues called out to them, identifying his unit. An officer emerged from a foxhole, smiled, and identified himself as Lieutenant Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineers. The time was 1,650 hours, December 26, 1944. The siege of Bastogne had been broken. Cobra King's role in that relief became legendary within the armored force. The tank that had led the column through German lines, survived defensive fire, and reached the surrounded paratroopers first, represented everything the M4A3E2 program had been designed to achieve. Heavy armor providing protection that let American tanks lead assaults without the catastrophic casualties standard Shermans suffered. The specific circumstances that made Cobra King famous, the dramatic relief of Bastogne, the desperate nature of the advance, the historical significance of the battle, overshadowed the tactical reality. Cobra King succeeded not merely because of individual crew skill or tactical brilliance, but because its armor let it survive fire that would have destroyed a standard Sherman. The M4A3E2's combat record through December 1944 and January 1945 established patterns that defined its effectiveness and limitations. The tanks excelled in exactly the tactical situations they'd been designed for, leading infantry assaults against prepared defensive positions. Their armor absorbed fire from German anti-tank weapons that destroyed standard Shermans reliably. They provided mobile firepower that could advance under fire and suppress defensive positions with high explosive shells. They demonstrated mechanical reliability comparable to standard Shermans despite carrying significantly more weight. The suspension problems Aberdeen's testing had revealed remained the primary maintenance concern, but didn't prevent the tanks from completing their missions. The limitations emerged through combat experience as well. The M4A3E2's reduced speed, 22 miles per hour maximum compared to the standard Sherman's 26, made them less suitable for exploitation operations where velocity mattered more than protection. Their weight, 42.6 metric tons, restricted their ability to cross bridges and fords that standard Shermans could negotiate safely. The 75mm gun, adequate for infantry support and fortification destruction, couldn't penetrate German heavy tank armor at ranges where German guns could kill the M4A3E2 by targeting weak points. The tanks functioned as intended, as assault vehicles supporting infantry operations, but proved less versatile than standard Shermans in fluid mobile warfare. By February 1945, American forces had transitioned from defensive operations in the Ardennes to renewed offensive operations toward the Rhine River. The tactical situation changed from resisting German attacks to conducting assaults against German defensive positions. This shift favored the M4A3E2's capabilities. The tanks led attacks on German cities including Cologne, Koblenz and Trier, their armor providing protection against German anti-tank weapons fired from prepared urban positions. The fighting in German cities combined all the elements that made assault tanks valuable: restricted fields of fire, prepared defensive positions, numerous obstacles, and close-range combat where armor thickness mattered more than gun penetration or mobility. The decision to upgun approximately 100 M4A3E2s with 76mm weapons in February 1945 reflected changing tactical requirements. The 75mm gun's high-explosive shell remained more effective against infantry and fortifications, but American commanders wanted anti-tank capability in tanks leading assault columns. The 76mm gun could penetrate Panther side armor at reasonable combat ranges, and Tiger frontal armor at very close range. The modification required 75 man-hours per tank, primarily spent modifying ammunition storage racks and adjusting turret balance. The work was performed by ordnance units in field workshops, demonstrating the M4A3E2's mechanical commonality with standard Shermans. Crews who had maintained M4A3 tanks could maintain M4A3E2s using the same procedures and similar parts. Cobra King received the 76mm gun upgrade in February 1945. The tank's crew also requested replacement of the 30 caliber coaxial machine gun with a 50 caliber weapon, providing more effective suppressive fire against German infantry positions. These modifications reflected crew preferences developed through combat experience. The thicker armor had proven its value by letting crews survive engagements that killed other Sherman crews. Now they wanted weapons that matched German capabilities more closely, even if it meant sacrificing some of the 75mm gun's infantry support effectiveness. The Rhine River crossing operations in March 1945 employed M4A3E2s in their designed assault role. The 3rd Armoured Division's capture of Cologne on March 6 saw multiple M4A3E2s leading street fighting operations through Germany's 4th largest city. The tanks absorbed Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck fire from German infantry, positioned in buildings, fire that disabled or destroyed lighter American armor. The M4A3E2's thick armor, while not proof against the shaped charge warheads these weapons employed, provided more protection than standard Sherman armor. Crews added additional protection nonetheless, welding sandbags, concrete, and logs to their tanks, despite the additional weight. The improvised armor created additional standoff distance between shaped charge warheads and the tank's actual armor, sometimes disrupting the jet penetration enough to prevent catastrophic damage. German defenders in Cologne noted the appearance of these heavily armored American tanks in their reports and diaries. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, fighting with the 9th Panzer Division's infantry elements in Cologne, described American tanks that seemed immune to Panzerfaust hits. His account, published in a post-war memoir, describes firing 3 Panzerfaust rockets at an American tank from approximately 50 meters. All 3 hit the tank's frontal armor. The tank continued advancing and destroyed Müller's position with machine gun fire. He survived only because he'd retreated to a basement after firing his 3rd rocket. The tank he'd engaged was almost certainly an M4A3E2, based on his description of its size and the heavy appearance of its turret and hull. The question of whether the M4A3E2 achieved its intended purpose can be answered through statistical analysis of combat losses. Of the 254 M4A3E2s produced, approximately 61 were destroyed or knocked out permanently during combat operations in Europe. This represents a 24% loss rate over approximately 7 months of combat. Standard M4 Shermans, by comparison, experienced loss rates approaching 40% in some units during similar timeframes. The M4A3E2's survival rate approximately doubled that of standard Shermans, precisely the improvement American planners had hoped to achieve through additional armor. The crew survival rate provides more significant data. Standard Sherman crews who were hit had approximately a 30% chance of the entire crew being killed or wounded seriously enough to prevent evacuation. M4A3E2 crews who were hit had approximately a 10% chance of total crew casualties. The thicker armor didn't just prevent tank destruction. It prevented crew casualties, even when the tank was damaged or disabled. Crews could evacuate through hatches before fire consumed the vehicle. They could survive hits that penetrated the armor because the reduced spalling and fragmentation didn't kill everyone in the crew compartment immediately. Lieutenant James Morrison of the 743rd Tank Battalion survived the war, despite his M4A3E2 being hit multiple times during operations near Aachen and during the Ardennes offensive. His post-war account describes 3 separate instances where his tank took hits that would have destroyed a standard Sherman. In one engagement near Langerehe in December 1944, an 88mm round struck his tank's glacis plate and failed to penetrate. The impact knocked out the bow machine gun and stunned the assistant driver, but the crew remained capable of fighting. Morrison withdrew, reported the damage, and returned to combat after field maintenance replaced the machine gun. In a standard Sherman, that same hit likely would have penetrated the thinner glacis plate, killed or wounded the driver and assistant driver, and possibly detonated ammunition stored in the hull. These individual accounts, accumulated across hundreds of combat actions, create a statistical pattern that validates the M4A3E2 program's fundamental premise. Additional armor, despite the weight penalty and reduced performance, saved American lives. The tanks cost more to produce than standard Shermans, approximately $12,000 per unit compared to $8,000 for a standard M4A3. They required more maintenance due to suspension and strain. They consumed more fuel per mile traveled due to increased weight. They sacrificed mobility and mechanical margin for protection. By every measure except crew survival, they represented less efficient use of industrial resources than standard Shermans. By the measure that mattered most to the men who crewed them, they represented a profound improvement. The German perspective on the M4A3E2 appears in scattered documents and post-war accounts, but never coalesced into systematic tactical doctrine. This absence is itself significant. The Germans had developed specific tactical procedures for engaging every major Allied tank type. Against Shermans, engage from maximum range with anti-tank guns or armor. Against Churchills, target the tracks to immobilize them, then destroy them with repeated hits. Against Soviet T-34 seconds, aim for turret ring or engine deck. The M4A3E2 appeared too infrequently and too late in the war for German forces to develop standardized countermeasures beyond the obvious, aim for weak points and use multiple hits. The confusion this caused among German anti-tank crews, accustomed to reliable kill ratios against American armor, had psychological effects that exceeded the M4A3E2's small numbers. Oberleutnant Friedrich Sander, commanding a power company in the Eifel region during February 1945, wrote to his family about the changing nature of combat against American forces. His letter, captured and translated by American intelligence, describes the frustration of watching American tanks advance despite being hit repeatedly. He notes that his gun crews were expending twice as much ammunition per kill compared to earlier in the war. He attributes this partly to better American tactics, partly to improved American armor, and partly to declining quality of German ammunition. All 3 factors contributed, but the appearance of tanks like the M4A3E2 represented a genuine capability improvement that German forces couldn't easily counter. By April 1945, the M4A3E2s were operating deep inside Germany alongside the newer M26 Pershing tanks that were finally arriving in theatre. The Pershing, with its 90mm gun and heavy armor, represented the assault tank American forces had originally requested in 1942. Its arrival made the M4A3E2 technically obsolescent, though both tanks continued serving side by side through the final weeks of the war. The Pershing offered superior firepower and comparable protection in a more integrated design. The M4A3E2 offered proven reliability and mechanical commonality with the thousands of standard Shermans already in service. Both approaches, the sophisticated new design and the up-armored existing design, achieved similar tactical results through different engineering philosophies. The last significant combat action involving M4A3E2s, occurred during the reduction of German resistance in Czechoslovakia in early May 1945. The 4th Armoured Division's advance toward Pilsen employed M4A3E2s in their familiar role, leading the assault columns and absorbing defensive fire. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, the M4A3E2s had been in combat for approximately 7 months. They'd fought through the Siegfried Line, survived the Ardennes offensive, crossed the Rhine, and advanced to Czechoslovakia. Of the 250 units that reached Europe, approximately 193 remained operational on VE Day. The remainder had been destroyed, permanently disabled, or cannibalized for spare parts. The post-war assessment of the M4A3E2 program balanced tactical success against industrial efficiency. The tanks had achieved their intended purpose, providing assault capability that reduced American casualties during offensive operations. They demonstrated that existing tank designs could be up-armored successfully using available industrial capacity. They'd proven that American armor could survive German anti-tank weapons when properly protected. These successes validated the program's rapid development and deployment. The limitations were equally clear. The 254 tanks produced represented a tiny fraction of the 49,000 Shermans manufactured during the war. Their impact on overall combat outcomes remained localized to the specific units that employed them. The suspension problems predicted during testing persisted throughout their service life, requiring maintenance resources that might have supported more standard tanks. The reduced mobility limited their tactical flexibility compared to standard Shermans. Most significantly, the M4A3E2 arrived only 7 months before the war ended in Europe. Earlier deployment might have prevented thousands of American casualties during the fighting in France and Belgium during summer and fall of 1944. The technological competition between armor and anti-tank weapons had governed ground combat since tanks first appeared in 1916. Each improvement in armor thickness prompted development of more powerful anti-tank guns. Each increase in gun penetration drove engineers to add more armor or improve armor quality. This cycle accelerated during World War II as industrial capacity enabled rapid production of both better protected tanks and more powerful weapons. The M4A3E2 represented a specific point in this cycle, where American industrial capacity allowed a brute force solution to the armor penetration problem. Rather than waiting for sophisticated new designs, American engineers simply added more armor to an existing tank until it could survive the weapons it would face. This approach differed fundamentally from German and Soviet armor development philosophy. German engineers pursued technical sophistication, creating tanks like the Panther and Tiger that integrated armor, firepower, and mobility into carefully balanced designs. These tanks represented excellent engineering but required precision manufacturing, skilled maintenance, and complex logistics. Soviet engineers prioritized simplicity and mass production, creating tanks like the T-34 that combined adequate armor and firepower with mechanical simplicity and cheap production. American engineers occupied a middle position, designing reliable tanks with adequate capabilities that could be manufactured in enormous quantities by automotive workers rather than specialized tank builders. The M4A3E2 extended this philosophy by demonstrating that adequate tanks could be upgraded to excellent tanks through simple addition of components. The composite armor concept that defined the M4A3E2 wasn't actually composite armor in the metallurgical sense. True composite armor combines different materials, metals, ceramics, plastics, to defeat specific threats through material properties rather than simple thickness. The M4A3E2's armor remained homogeneous rolled steel throughout. The term composite appeared in some post-war documents because the armor consisted of multiple plates welded together rather than single thick plates. This construction method reflected wartime manufacturing constraints more than sophisticated armor science. Fisher Bodies workers could weld multiple thin plates more easily than they could work with single thick plates, requiring specialized equipment. The welded armor construction created potential weak points where plates joined. German anti-tank guns that failed to penetrate solid armor sometimes achieved penetration at weld seams where material properties changed. American metallurgists understood this problem, but accepted it as inevitable given production constraints. Perfect armor plates individually cast or forged to exact specifications would have provided better protection, but would have required months of additional development and specialized manufacturing facilities. The M4A3E2 needed to reach combat quickly, so it used available materials and existing welding techniques. The result proved adequate despite theoretical imperfections. German crews who examined, captured, or destroyed M4A3E2s reported their findings to intelligence officers who compiled assessments of Allied armor. These reports, captured at war's end and translated by American intelligence, reveal German understanding of American armor development. A report dated March 1945 from the 9th Panzer Division's intelligence section describes examination of a destroyed M4A3E2 near Cologne. The report accurately measures armor thickness and correctly identifies the tank as a modified M4 rather than a new design. It notes the suspension strain visible in worn springs and cracked bogie assemblies. It observes that the gun mantlet represents a weak point vulnerable to repeated hits. The assessment concludes that the Americans had successfully created an assault tank comparable to German heavy tanks in frontal protection while retaining Sherman mechanical reliability. This German assessment proved more accurate than many Allied assessments written during the war. British armour officers who examined M4A3E2s in early 1945 expressed scepticism about the design's longevity. They predicted that the suspension would fail catastrophically within weeks of intensive combat operations. They questioned whether the Ford engine could sustain the power output required to move the tank's weight over extended periods. They suggested that the armour protection, while impressive, came at unacceptable cost in mobility and mechanical reliability. These predictions proved incorrect, but reflected reasonable engineering concerns based on British experience with their own up-armoured tank designs. The British had attempted similar armour improvements with Churchill tanks, adding applique armour plates to existing vehicles. These modifications created severe mechanical problems, including transmission failures, suspension collapses,
Up next,
and engine
you've
overheating.
got two more standout
the British
stories right on your
suggested that
If this one
significantly
hit the
increasing
mark,
a tank's
you won't
weight
want
without
to pass these up.
redesigning
Just
its
click and
automotive
check them
components
out.
led
And
inevitably
don't forget
to
to
catastrophic
subscribe and turn on the
mechanical
notification bell
The Americans
so you don't
avoided
miss
these
any
failures
upload from
partly
us.
through the Sherman's robust automotive design and partly through careful management of weight distribution using the extended track connectors. The M4A3E2 proved that up-armoring could succeed if engineering solutions addressed the weight's mechanical effects systematically. Soviet armor officers never encountered M4A3E2s in combat, as these tanks served exclusively in Western Europe. However, Soviet intelligence received information about them through liaison with American forces. The Soviet assessment, declassified in the 1990 seconds, notes with approval the American willingness to sacrifice mobility for protection. Soviet tank doctrine had evolved through costly experience on the Eastern Front, where inadequate armor led to catastrophic losses during 1941 and 1942. By 1943, Soviet designers prioritized armor thickness over nearly all other considerations. The T-34 divided by 85's thick sloped armor and the IS-2's massive frontal plate reflected this philosophy. The Soviets viewed the M4A3E2 as validation of their own doctrinal evolution toward heavier armor despite mobility penalties. The crews who operated M4A3E2s through the final months of the European War developed affection for their tanks despite or perhaps because of the mechanical quirks and limitations. Tank crews generally grew attached to vehicles that brought them through combat alive. The M4A3E2's thick armor created a level of confidence that standard Sherman crews rarely experienced. Sergeant Robert Thompson of the 746th Tank Battalion described feeling, for the first time since landing in Europe, that his tank might actually protect him from German anti-tank weapons. This psychological factor, difficult to quantify but significant in combat effectiveness, represented one of the M4A3E2's most important contributions. Crews who believed their tanks could survive fought more aggressively and made bolder tactical decisions than crews who expected to die if hit. The maintenance burden the M4A3E2 imposed on ordnance units reflected the design's primary compromise. Field maintenance reports from 1st Army Ordnance units during February and March 1,945 document suspension component replacement rates approximately 3 times higher for M4A3E2S than for standard M4A3 tanks. The vertical volute springs required frequent replacement. Bogie assemblies worked loose and needed retightening at intervals measured in days rather than weeks. Track pins wore faster due to increased weight and stress. These problems never prevented the tanks from completing missions, but required maintenance time and spare parts that otherwise would have supported more tanks in operation. The ordnance personnel who maintained M4A3E2S improvised solutions to recurring problems, using available materials and existing M4 spare parts. When vertical volute springs failed, crews sometimes installed springs from standard Shermans in pairs to share the load. When track pins wore excessively, maintenance crews fabricated heavier pins from available steel stock and machined them to fit. These field expedients kept the tanks operational despite mechanical stress their components weren't designed to withstand. The ability to maintain combat effectiveness through improvisation represented a broader pattern in American military logistics, where abundant resources and skilled mechanics compensated for equipment operating beyond designed parameters. By late April 1945, American forces advancing into Germany encountered decreasing resistance as the Wehrmacht collapsed under pressure from east and west simultaneously. The M4A3E2S continued leading assault columns, but the tactical situations that had required their thick armor occurred less frequently. German defenders abandoned prepared positions rather than fighting to destruction. Anti-tank guns withdrew rather than engaging a town. Disadvantageous ranges. The chaotic final weeks of the war saw American armor advancing rapidly through disintegrating German defenses where mobility mattered more than protection. Standard Shermans, with their higher speed and better mobility, proved more useful than the slower, heavier M4A3E2S during this exploitation phase. The most controversial episode involving M4A3E2S occurred during Operation Hammelburg, Patton's secret mission to liberate American prisoners of war held at Oflag 13B camp near Hammelburg. Task Force Baum, formed from elements of the 37th Tank Battalion, included several M4A3E2S among its mixed force of tanks and infantry. The task force penetrated 50 miles behind German lines in March 1945, liberated the camp, but was overwhelmed by German forces during the attempted return. Captain Abraham Baum, commanding the task force, later stated that an M4A3E2, named Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Nutto, was knocked out on March 27th, when a Panzerfaust round penetrated its armor and ignited ammunition. The entire task force was destroyed or captured, with only 35 men reaching American lines from the original 314 who began the mission. This particular Cobra King wasn't the same tank that had relieved Bastogne. The 37th Tank Battalion had multiple tanks, and crews frequently reused names from disabled tanks on replacement vehicles. The confusion about whether Cobra King of Bastogne fame participated in the Hammelburg raid persisted for decades after the war, demonstrating how tank identities became entangled with the famous actions they participated in. The specific M4A3E2 destroyed at Hammelburg showed that even the jumbo's thick armor couldn't protect against shaped charge weapons at close range in the ambush conditions German forces created around the task force. The shaped charge threat, primarily Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck weapons, represented the evolution of anti-tank warfare toward portable infantry weapons rather than towed guns. These weapons used explosive chemistry rather than kinetic energy to defeat armor. A shaped charge focuses explosive energy into a narrow jet of superheated metal that can penetrate armor far thicker than the weapon's physical size would suggest. The M4A3E2's armor, designed to resist kinetic energy penetrators from anti-tank guns, provided less protection against shaped charges. The additional armor thickness did increase standoff distance between the warhead and the tank's hull, sometimes disrupting the shaped charge jet enough to prevent complete penetration. However, this protection remained unreliable compared to the tank's effectiveness against kinetic penetrators. Crews understood this vulnerability and responded by adding improvised protection. Sandbags, logs, spare track links, concrete, all appeared on M4A3E2 during late winter and spring of 1945. These additions served two purposes. First, they increased standoff distance between shaped charge warheads and the tank's actual armor, potentially disrupting the penetrating jet. Second, they provided psychological comfort to crews who wanted to believe they were making their tanks safer. The actual effectiveness of these improvised additions remained questionable. Some probably helped in specific circumstances. Others added weight and maintenance burden without providing meaningful protection. All demonstrated that crews would do anything they believed might improve their survival chances. The Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945, ended any possibility that M4A3E2 would see combat in the Pacific Theater. Plans had called for shipping M26 Pershings and M4A3E8 Shermans with horizontal volute spring suspension to the Pacific for the planned invasion of Japan. The M4A3E2, with its vertical volute spring suspension and excessive weight, was considered obsolete even before Germany surrendered. The tank had been designed for a specific tactical problem, breaking through prepared German defences on the Western Front. That problem ceased to exist in May 1945. The M4A3E2's combat career lasted exactly 7 months, from October 1944 through May 1945, possibly the shortest operational lifespan of any American tank design that saw significant combat. The post-war disposition of M4A3E2 followed the pattern of most specialized equipment rendered obsolete by changing tactical requirements. Some tanks returned to the United States for depot storage. Others remained in Europe as training vehicles or gate guards at American installations. Many were scrapped, their thick armor plates cut apart for steel recycling. By August 1948, depot records showed 96 M4A3E2 in storage, designated not ready for issue. These tanks underwent refurbishment during the 1,950 seconds as part of the Army's Sherman remanufacturing program. The refurbishment removed obsolete components and updated others to late war standards, creating serviceable training tanks from combat veterans. The refurbished M4A3E2 found their way to National Guard units during the 1,950 seconds, serving as training vehicles for crews who would never encounter combat in them. The 194th Tank Battalion of the Minnesota National Guard operated several M4A3E2 alongside standard M4 Shermans during the mid-1950 seconds. These tanks taught basic gunnery, driving, and maintenance to National Guardsmen whose military service would likely never extend beyond weekend drills and summer training camps. The massive assault tanks, designed for desperate combat against Germany's best defences, ended their careers teaching young Americans how to operate equipment that was already obsolete before they were born. One M4A3E2 achieved special status through abandonment rather than service. After the fighting ended in Belgium, a damaged M4A3E2 was left by the roadside in the village of Hermiton-sur-Meuse. In 1948, American forces offered this abandoned tank to Dr. Paul Michel, a local dentist who had operated a medical center during the battle for the Meuse River in 1944 and 1945. The tank became a war memorial, sitting beside the road as a rusting reminder of the fighting that had devastated the region. For decades it remained there, slowly deteriorating in Belgian weather. The story took an unusual turn when Dr. Michel's heirs claimed ownership of the tank after his death. Investigation revealed that the U.S. Army had never formally transferred ownership, meaning the American government still technically owned the memorial tank sitting in a Belgian village. The U.S. government initiated negotiations to recover the tank, noting that M4A3E2 had become rare enough to have significant historical and monetary value. The village of Hermiton-sur-Meuse objected, arguing that the tank had become part of their local history and shouldn't be removed. After extended discussions, a compromise emerged. The tank would remain in Belgium, but would be restored and relocated to the Royal Museum of the Armed Forces and Military History in Brussels. The restored M4A3E2, serial number 50511, registration number 3083108, eventually moved to Bastogne Barracks, where it remains on display. Cobra King's post-war story proved more complex. After the war, a shell-damaged and fire-gutted M4A3E2 sat in a repair depot at Lager Hammelburg before being moved to serve as a gate guard at McKee Barracks in Crailsheim, Germany in 1957. The anonymous tank moved between American installations over the decades, from Crailsheim to Ferris Barracks in Erlangen in 1967, then to Rose Barracks in Vilsec in 1993. As Army historians gradually investigated the histories of World War II tanks still in Europe, Army Chaplain Keith Good began suspecting that the deteriorating tank at Rose Barracks might be the Cobra King that had relieved Bastogne. In 2008, Army historians confirmed Chaplain Good's suspicion. The serial number and registration number matched. The battle damage to the final drive corresponded to Cobra King's documented combat history. The anonymous gate guard was indeed the first tank to reach Bastogne's surrounded defenders. In July 2009, the Army shipped Cobra King from Germany to the Patton Museum at Fort Knox for restoration. The work required 2 years and demanded extensive searching for authentic components. Restorers located an original Ford V8 engine, a 75mm gun, and tracks matching Cobra King's original configuration. They restored the exterior to its December 1944 appearance, but left the fire-damaged interior essentially unchanged, preserving the physical evidence of the tank's violent history. After restoration, Cobra King moved to Fort Benning, Georgia in August 2011, before being shipped to the construction site of the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, in August 2017. The tank and several other significant vehicles were literally placed on the museum's foundation before the building was constructed around them. When the museum opened on Veterans Day, November 11, 2020, Cobra King occupied a place of honor in the permanent collection. The tank that had led the relief of Bastogne became a memorial to the crews who had fought in all Shermans, standard and up-armored, throughout the war. The technical lessons the M4A3E2 program provided influenced post-war American armor development more than the tanks themselves influenced combat outcomes. The program demonstrated that existing designs could be rapidly modified to meet new tactical requirements using available industrial capacity. This lesson informed American armor development during the Korean War and Cold War, when upgrading existing tanks often provided capability improvements faster and cheaper than developing completely new designs. The M48 Patton's various upgrade programs, the M60's evolution through multiple variants, and even the M1 Abrams' ongoing modernization reflected the philosophy that adequate platforms could be continuously improved rather than replaced. The composite armor concept, misnamed in the M4A3E2's case but legitimate in principle, became central to post-war armor development. True composite armor, combining different materials to defeat specific threats, appeared in British Chobham armor during the 1962 and subsequently in the M1 Abrams and other modern tanks. These sophisticated composites bore no direct technical relationship to the M4A3E2's welded steel plates, but shared the conceptual foundation that armor could be engineered to defeat specific threats rather than simply made thicker. The evolution from simple thickness to material science represented the armor versus weapon competition continuing into new dimensions. The German crews who had encountered M4A3E2s and survived the war carried their experiences into post-war German society. Some became engineers in Germany's rebuilt industries, bringing knowledge of American manufacturing efficiency and design pragmatism. Others remained in military service, eventually joining the Bundeswehr when West Germany rearmed in 1955. A few immigrated to the United States, their wartime service against American forces becoming historical curiosity rather than barrier to citizenship. Friedrich Kellner, The anti-tank gun commander who had failed to kill an M4A3E2 near Lohn in November 1944 worked as a machinist in Düsseldorf after the war. His post-war employment records show no indication that his failure to penetrate American armor influenced his career. He was simply one of millions of German veterans integrating into civilian life. The American crews who had operated M4A3E2s returned to civilian life carrying their own memories and perspectives. James Morrison, who had survived multiple combat engagements in his 743rd Tank Battalion M4A3E2, became an automotive engineer in Detroit. His obituary in 1998 mentioned his war service briefly, noting that he'd served in an armored unit in Europe. It didn't mention that his tank had been hit multiple times without penetrating, or that the armor had saved his life repeatedly. These details remained private memories rather than public history, until researchers interviewing surviving veterans decades later documented them. Charles Boggess, who had commanded Cobra King during the relief of Bastogne, remained in the army after the war. He retired as a colonel in 1969 after serving in Korea and Vietnam. His military career extended far beyond his famous moment leading the column into Bastogne, but that moment defined his public identity. Interviews with Boggess in later life focused almost exclusively on December 26, 1944, as if the remaining 25 years of military service existed merely as epilogue to that single afternoon. He accepted this focus with grace, understanding that some historical moments overshadow everything else in a life. The question of whether the M4A3E2 program justified its costs requires examining multiple measures of effectiveness. In purely military terms, the 254 tanks produced represented negligible percentage of total Sherman production. Their impact on combat outcomes remained localized to specific units and engagements. Germany would have lost the war on identical timeline whether M4A3E2s existed or not. By these measures, the program's strategic impact approached insignificance. The measure that mattered involved the American soldiers whose lives the M4A3E2's armor saved. The approximately 193 tanks that survived the war intact meant roughly 1,000 crew members completed their combat service alive rather than becoming casualties. The tanks destroyed or damaged in combat showed dramatically lower crew mortality rates than standard Shermans, meaning additional hundreds of crew members survived hits that would have killed them in thinner armored tanks. These statistical abstractions represented real men, with real families, whose futures continued because Fisher, body workers in Grand Blanc, Michigan, had welded additional armor plates onto Sherman hulls during summer of 1944. The tactical validation the program provided extended beyond simple casualty reduction. The M4A3E2 proved that American industry could respond to immediate combat requirements faster than any other combatant nation. From initial request in February 1944 to combat deployment in October 1944 represented 8 months, a timeline that included design, production, shipping, and tactical integration. German programs to improve Panther and Tiger tanks consumed years. Soviet programs to upgrade T-34 variants required extensive development periods. British attempts to up-armor Churchill tanks created mechanical disasters requiring extended remediation. American industrial capacity and engineering pragmatism permitted solutions that other nations couldn't replicate. The psychological impact on both American and German forces, though difficult to quantify, contributed to combat effectiveness in measurable ways. American crews who believed their tanks could survive fought more aggressively. German crews who couldn't reliably kill American tanks fought more cautiously. These behavioral changes influenced tactical outcomes at company and battalion level, even when M4A3E2s represented small minority of tanks engaged. The reputation effects extended beyond actual presence. German defensive positions sometimes withdrew when American tanks appeared, unable to distinguish regular Shermans from up-armored variants at distance. This uncertainty reduced German defensive effectiveness, even when the tanks advancing were standard M4s. The historical memory of the M4A3E2 remained obscure for decades after the war. Military historians focused on more numerous tanks like the standard Sherman, or more technically sophisticated designs like the Pershing. The jumbo nickname, now commonly used, appeared rarely in contemporary documents and didn't become standard until enthusiast publications adopted it during the 1970 seconds and 1980 seconds. The tank existed in historical records as a specialized variant, interesting to experts but unknown to general audiences. This obscurity ended gradually as military history became more detailed and accessible. Arnold Kramer's research on German prisoners of war in America led to investigation of German perspectives on American equipment. His interviews with former German soldiers during the 1970 seconds documented their surprise at encountering American tanks they couldn't kill reliably. British historian Stephen Zalogar's detailed studies of Sherman variants during the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds brought technical information about the M4A3E2 to wider audiences. The restoration and display of surviving examples, particularly Cobra King at the National Museum of the United States Army, created physical connections to history that photographs and documents couldn't provide. Model kit manufacturers discovered the M4A3E2 during the 2000s, producing detailed scale replicas that introduced the tank to hobbyists and collectors. These models, accurate to individual weld seams and attachment points, preserved technical details that photographs alone couldn't capture. The model-building community's attention to accuracy forced manufacturers to research original documentation, creating feedback loop where hobbyist interest drove historical research that produced better information that enabled more accurate models. The Internet age transformed access to M4A3E2, information from specialized research, requiring archive visits to readily available digital resources. Scanned unit histories, digitized photographs, translated German documents, and veteran interviews became accessible to anyone interested in the subject. Online communities of armor enthusiasts shared information, corrected errors, and gradually built comprehensive understanding of the M4A3E2's development, deployment, and combat record. This democratization of historical research meant that the previously obscure assault tank gained recognition commensurate with its actual significance. The M4A3E2's story ultimately transcends technical specifications and tactical employment. It represents American industrial capacity applied to immediate military problems without waiting for perfect solutions. It demonstrates that adequate existing designs improved quickly can outperform sophisticated new designs delivered slowly. It shows that protecting soldiers through better equipment justifies economic costs that pure military analysis might question. Most fundamentally, it proves that armor thickness, the oldest and simplest form of tank protection, remained relevant even as weapons evolved to defeat it. The German crews who first encountered M4A3E2s in October and November 1944 experienced cognitive dissonance between their expectations and observed reality. They'd spent years developing expertise in killing Sherman tanks. They understood Sherman vulnerabilities intimately, knew exactly where to aim, knew how much ammunition each kill required. Then, American tanks appeared that absorbed their 88mm rounds without dying, that kept advancing despite taking hits that should have been catastrophic, that survived long enough for their crews to evacuate even when finally disabled. This confrontation between expectation and reality, between doctrine and experience, represented more than tactical surprise. It demonstrated that technological competition never ends, that every solution creates new problems requiring new solutions. The Americans hadn't developed revolutionary technology or innovative tactics. They'd simply added more armor to existing tanks because they could, because their industrial capacity permitted solutions that poorer nations couldn't afford. This brute force approach lacked elegance but achieved effectiveness. The M4A3E2 wasn't beautiful. It wasn't sophisticated. It was simply adequate armor on a reliable chassis, produced quickly and deployed immediately. These prosaic qualities made it more valuable than technically superior designs that arrived too late or in insufficient numbers. The composite armor that gave the M4A3E2 its modern nickname wasn't actually composite, just layered welded plates. The protection it provided wasn't revolutionary, just sufficient to resist contemporary threats at combat ranges. The tactical impact wasn't decisive, just meaningful enough to save lives and influence engagements. The historical legacy isn't legendary, just solid enough to merit preservation and study. These qualified assessments define the M4A3E2 accurately. It was a good tank that did what it needed to do when it needed to do it. In war, achieving adequacy rapidly matters more than pursuing perfection slowly. The German crews, who never expected American composite armor to make Sherman's Panzer-Proof, learned that military advantage emerges not just from superior technology, but from superior capacity to implement adequate technology quickly. The Americans didn't out-engineer the Germans. They outproduced them, outsupplied them, and out-adapted them. The M4A3E2 represented this American approach to warfare distilled to its essence. Identify problem, apply resources, implement solution, deploy immediately. The tank itself was just welded steel and mechanical components. What it represented was industrial civilization mobilized for war, transforming production capacity into tactical advantage faster than opponents could respond. That transformation, not the tank itself, determined the war's outcome. The M4A3E2 simply made that transformation visible to the German gun crews watching their 88mm rounds bounce off American steel that shouldn't have been thick enough to stop them.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.